Want to give a big thank you to Allison, as always, for putting this together. Honestly, the third year. It's only been 2 years since we really started this, but it's always been a lot of fun every year. And I know your team has done an amazing amount of work. And I also think you're probably slightly underappreciated for the amount that it throws you a little bit off too, and in everything that you're trying to do and all that you have to do. So anyway, so thank you very much, first and foremost. And then for me, this last year or so has been a little bit crazy, and I want to put out a big thank you to Tracy, who I met here 2 years ago, for helping me put together the Mr. Regulatory brand. I mean, it's actually her brainchild to a large degree, and it's helped me get some of the website up and running and get the videos moving. So a big thank you to Tracy, and then most recently for Melissa as well, who's been helping me with getting things back up and running since Tracy's taken a full-time gig doing something else. So anyway, so thank you guys as well for anybody who's checked out videos, or if you have any ideas for us. We're rethinking some of the content, trying to make some shorter videos that are a little bit more concise. I have a tendency to ramble. I have the gift of gab, but nobody ever gave me the gift of shutting up. So anyway, some things to work on as we move forward with all that. But it's been a lot of fun. And if I don't know if you guys noticed it on Monday, that's not actually my logo down there in the corner. It's a caffeine molecule with a little bit of a logo on it. So we're trying to have fun with it. And I'm just curious. So for those of you guys in the room, how much experience do you guys have with home use devices? Are you planning on doing anything with home use devices? Just a show of hands, or so there's some interest in this space. Like in the future, any interest, or you're like, we're done with this? That was a horrible disaster. We're never doing that again. Anyway, well. We'll get into that in just a second. I couldn't resist. I had to start with some memes actually here when we start. But actually, I guess that's my next slide. But first off, start with this. So I also had the experience with this test of taking it, and that's my negative up there. A home use device that I used this week. It's an OIVD product, but it is kind of amazing that I can walk into a CVS, at least in Redding, maybe not down here in San Diego. I don't know that the availability is great in some of the larger cities, but I was able to walk in and just pick this up off the shelf, and that is a game changer, I think, for us. Even though, at the cost, I wouldn't go around doing twice weekly screenings, for all this, at least not of my entire household. For COVID, but definitely for a trip to grandma, or or for this conference, I do that, and I expect that's, as we move forward, going to be a big piece of what we do. And I just want to take a moment as well to highlight how close to home this has gotten, and pun intended, maybe. I had a respiratory virus back in March of 2020. I don't know if it was COVID, but I felt awful, and it's had long-standing effects. My wife definitely had COVID in fall of 2020. And so having access to the vaccines, having access to testing is a real game changer, I think, just from a public health standpoint for all of us, despite the concerns that we all have about what the future looks like. And I, for one, particularly value this is a tool moving forward. If we can get to having broader accessibility of lower cost home use devices, I do think that we can actually see behavior patterns and all of this change in a positive way to help us better fight the pandemic. So I'm hoping that we do end up with more with more tools for this public health emergency, as FDA has called it. And my personal mission is all about empowering people and trying to align or better align incentives. And I think that's one thing that FDA's been more aware of, I would say, than some of the other regulatory agencies involved in all this and thinking about how we drive behavior in some positive ways. But I think we definitely still have some room for improvement there. And so we'll see where this goes. But now to the memes. So good news, everyone. I don't know if you know Professor Farnsworth, but if you don't, you'll have to check him out. He says good news when it's anything but. Or I guess I would say, in the words of a recent FDA inspector at what should have been a closing meeting, do you want the good news or the bad news? I won't finish that with what she actually said. It was horrifying. But you know, I spent some time watching the videos that FDA put out, and they put out some of these videos ages ago, and you can find them on YouTube under other people's channels. And FDA has a CPAP video that's you know, there, and I think I'll identify. There's some actor that I didn't even recognize, you know, who was involved in this, and it's, you know, from ages ago. FDA still has some of these videos. And I get the very clear sense in those videos that we're from the government and we're here to help. And you know, while I've personally been accused of being inconveniently helpful, you know, I think in general FDA is fairly self-aware. And I would say, you know, despite everything else going on, that is really good news for us. I'll tell you a quick story. So when I was at FDA, it was late one evening, and I just finished up with some meetings that had, maybe it was an appeal that had moved up, you know, because I had just been interacting with some more senior people in ODE, and the one senior leader, I won't tell you his name, but he's walking down the hallway, and we just met earlier that day. I catch him briefly on his way out. He's in a good mood. We're talking about how things have gone and where things are headed and what we still have left to try to wrap up on this. And we had this customer service initiative that we were doing at the time. And I don't know how many of you maybe here were there for this. But his take on this in a moment of levity, and is sort of the end of the day, I'm the only one there. And he says, you know, we sort of had an informal motto at FDA before you, you know, years ago before you got here, that at FDA, we're not happy until you're not happy. And, you know, he meant it as a joke. But, you know, I think sometimes it can feel a little bit real. Anyway, it just makes me wonder, you're sort of thinking about that, really how Medufa negotiations might be going. So this is actually a demotivational poster I had on my door at FDA for a number of years. So yeah, it maybe gives you a sense for some of the attitude on some of these things at times. Anyway, getting back on track though, I do want to start here with a few examples of home use devices. Now, this is by no means comprehensive. We talked about some other devices. CPAPs aren't on here, and there are other products that didn't make it onto this list that I put up here. But I did want to highlight that devices in the same therapeutic area cross classifications. And that's really what I want to show you here. And that's true in general, but it's a little bit shocking to me, especially, let's say, in wound care, where you just run the gamut for very similar products in terms of what their classification is. And some of these products might be identical except for the addition of, let's say, silver or some other some other agents. For the class 2, products, you've got some negative wound therapy systems. You might have some of the some very similar types of dressings used that have added negative pressure, for instance. And also for the area of fecal incontinence, depending on exactly what you're looking at, it might be a class 1 product, it might be a class 2 product. You also have urinary catheters or implanted urinary incontinence systems. And the ones I'm familiar with are primarily mechanical in nature, but where it's not just a bulking agent. You actually have daily manipulation of this product by a user in their home. And also infusion sets and pumps, and then some of what we've seen with artificial pancreas and insulin pumps, and how that crosses some of these classification boundaries, as I said earlier, sometimes quite significantly. It's important to highlight that FDA has been fairly active in the space, at least for a decade now. And they started an initiative back in 2010 and published a white paper. And within this white paper, they outlined 5 areas. And these are the 5 areas that I've put up here. Interestingly, I'll get into this in my comments on, on this. There are some aspects of what they've highlighted that on the current push and website, they've been noticeably silent, in some of these areas. So the guidance came primarily out of a May 4th, 2010 public workshop and written comments received on that draft guidance. In 2016, FDA issued a proposed rule on submission of electronic labeling for home use devices. I think the comment period ended on the 17th of January 2017, right before there were some significant changes that maybe have derailed that. I don't know if we'll see that come back, or if that's just sort of abandoned in the current COVID crisis, or what's happening there. On the web page, FDA has highlighted several groups they've collaborated with to enhance public awareness. So this idea of partnering with home health accrediting bodies, and work on enhanced post-market oversight, at least at the time, 10 years ago, focused on MedSun surveillance in the areas of home hemodialysis, which I have some direct experience in, as well as negative pressure wound therapy devices, which I worked on after leaving FDA, and also labeling and testing related to the home use environment. And it's interesting, in those 2 therapeutic areas, I think a lot of the concerns that FDA had at the time, some of them are going to persist, but to a large degree, some of the issues that they were trying to address have, as far as I can tell, been addressed in terms of some of the post-market surveillance aspects. And curiously, FDA has omitted reference to enhanced post-market oversight on the home use initiative webpage. Though in the area of hemodialysis, I am aware of some ongoing post-market surveillance that FDA has been pushing for and will be getting. But it's not something that's, I don't think it's going to broadly affect companies. Now, for a little bit of a tangent, at around the same time as the home use initiative, FDA was pushing for negative indication statements in several areas. I don't know if you guys might remember this. So, clearly identifying pediatric subgroups, for instance, or including the labeling, not for pediatric use, or even in an indication statement or something like this. Not for home use was one of those areas, at least for a brief period of time, that FDA was pushing adding some of these statements into labels for devices that were not for home use. But it's not that the company came in and said, we want to label it not for home use. FDA is saying, well, if it's not for home use, we want you to label it not for home use. And it's interesting that FDA also omits this language on the home use initiative web pages. And I don't think that they've been pushing that recently, but it's interesting to note. If you're aware of anything in that area, I would be interested to hear sort of what maybe is a little bit more current on let's say, this language of quote unquote not for home use. I absolutely love Seth's explanation of this yesterday regarding the history of where we've gotten to and the medical devices drug problem. So I actually, this is his slide that you can see Seth over there in the corner. And I was looking at my slides and trying to figure out how to segue here and what I'm about to show you. And this is basically Seth's talk yesterday is a great layup for where I'm going to go a little bit with this around this not for human use language, because some of the best examples of where we're coming from or why we're at where we are today is from the drug space. And that was really, as far as I can tell, what was driving some of these negative indication statements is how we normally think about labeling drugs. And you can have some of these very same or similar statements in drug labeling. And this provides a good framework of reference for thinking about home use of medical devices, as well as, I would say, a number of other areas. And pediatrics is just the one thing that really jumps out to me, but I think there are some other areas as well. Now, this is not a medical device, okay? But this is a product for which a not for home use by patient statement was removed based on clinical evidence and some labeling changes that this company did. And so if you have any of these not for home use statements, or if you have a device which is specifically intended for a healthcare facility use and not for home use, this can be a helpful framework for thinking about. I'll show you some images in just a second, and what FDA is going to want to see in terms of how you would move towards labeling a product, let's say that you've already developed for hospital use or in-center use, and then segueing into a home setting. And so here you see now there's text accompanying each of these, and it's actually very brief text, but it's difficult to it's not aligned very well, and I think the draft that's available online for this particular product, but FDA is going to want to see images along these lines in general for some of these home use products, where maybe there's a very short descriptive text. I mean, very brief, briefer than you think is reasonable. Wash hands or something. For one of those. But images like this for application and removal of this product, and this is for a lidocaine product, which is sort of on that verge of the device space. So it's at least used before a medical device is used, or it's in some cases I could imagine where this kind of a product could be a medical device, and the lidocaine could be a sort of supplemental aspect to it. So, and then this is just some information. I won't belabor the point on this particular product and what happened, but FDA approved the removal of that not for home use label restriction based on the completion of clinical data. And I think in the device space, probably something like a human factors study might be sufficient, depending on what we're talking about. But FDA is really concerned about some of the the labeling, and other issues in this space. Getting back to medical devices, what is a home use medical device? A home use medical device is a medical device intended for users in any environment outside of a professional healthcare facility. And in FDA's guidance, and I think we'll see this in some of the text later, they would identify use in an automobile, use in other public spaces. We're not just talking about use in someone's home. We're talking about any use that's outside of a professional healthcare facility. And importantly, if you have a device that's intended for both professional healthcare facilities and for use in homes or other environments, you also fall under this umbrella category and need to be taking some of these things into consideration. And as I sort of highlighted to the side here, these could be prescription use, non-prescription. These could be mobile medical apps. These could be, sort of your standard run-of-the-mill devices, but anything that's outside of a professional healthcare facility. And then there are a couple unique considerations in the home. And FDA has identified this actually on one of their web pages that I can't find unless I do a Google search. So I've given you the link here just for future reference. If you want to find this information, you're going to need to go to the link or do a Google search to find it, because if you go to FDA's home use web pages, I wasn't able to navigate to this page from other FDA pages, but this page will navigate back to FDA's home use page. And a couple of unique considerations for medical devices used in the home are around location, age and type of a home, and environmental hazards, which are outlined here. The FDA has put out a guidance for home use devices, and in this guidance, in design considerations for devices intended for home use, FDA makes clear that this guidance document applies to prescription and OTC devices, to all classes of devices, and for design and development of a home use device or for a device likely to be used in the home, even if not solely intended to be used in the home, as we talked about just a minute ago. And also note that this guidance includes some post-market considerations that you should keep in mind as well if you have one of these types of products. So I think these environmental considerations are spelled out pretty, in a pretty straightforward way in the guidance as well as on the slide. I'm not going to belabor the point here. There are also user considerations. So this is going to be around the physical, sensory, cognitive, and emotional aspects of the intended use populations that FDA is wanting you to make sure that you're considering when developing a product for home use. And there are also some design considerations, and this is by far the most extensive part of FDA's guidance. And I'm going to actually say if there are guidance documents that are specific to your product area as well beyond this, I expect there's quite a bit of work that's going to have to be done in these areas for a home use device. But specifically think about lockout mechanisms and make sure that you've figured out how you're managing maintenance and calibration, and think about the mechanical and electrical aspects of the device if there are electrical aspects or wireless and EMC considerations for these products. So that's fairly well spelled out. And they also spell out some human factors and labeling considerations. And we'll go into some more detail on some of these aspects in the later slide as well. So do keep in mind that FDA put out a draft guidance, or FDA has a number of guidances, I should say, in human factors. And so FDA highlights some very high-level things here, but I'm actually going to get into the weeds a little bit for the human factors guidance that I think is actually specifically applicable, and in particular as well, FDA has a guidance on devices that they expect are going to need a heightened level of human factors, attention, and that's where some of the information that we'll talk about later comes from. So the human factors guidance is still in draft, last that I checked. And while we all know that FDA doesn't implement draft guidance until it's finalized, Allison's over here laughing. Please do keep in mind, okay, if I'm going to be most generous, about it, that FDA puts out draft guidance to let us all know what their thought process is in this area, and what their thinking is, and potentially to refine their position as well. So consider this draft guidance in that kind of a framework for understanding what's going on at FDA and what you're going to have to consider if going to FDA. And here are some potential home use devices that are highlighted in FDA's human factors draft guidance, or in terms of the list of highest priority devices for human factors review. And that includes an artificial pancreas system, which is, it's actually, I think this image makes it look a lot less complicated than it probably is, to be fair. Auto injectors, which seem like a pretty simple device, but there's a lot of effort that goes into making them user-friendly and simple, and different kinds of things can go wrong. I was recently talking with some people that make, they make auto injectors for, for people to test on themselves before they use the actual, auto injector. So they've sort of mocked it up without the sharps, and it functions in the same way. And then patients can get familiar and sort of do a dry run from sort of a human factor standpoint, figure out how this thing works before having to actually stick themselves for the first time. There are automated external defibrillators. There's a ton of them. I'm sure this is not comprehensive by any means. That list of them there on the slide. There are also home hemodialysis and peritoneal dialysis systems. Peritoneal dialysis systems, I didn't highlight these, were both of those images that popped up are hemodialysis machines that are used in the home, but peritoneal dialysis systems are also used in the home. Some different risk factors between those devices, but still pretty high risk products that end up being regulated as class 2 used in the home. And if you do it wrong, you can exsanguinate in just a couple of minutes. So and that does happen in some cases, both intentionally, by users as well as unintentionally. So it's sort of a fraught area. What I think of as sort of class 2 devices that are more or less class 3 products. It's sort of like they're regulated as 510Ks, but those 510Ks, it'd be volumes and volumes. It's as big as a PMA for people that ever saw that physically on their desk. When they used to bring these documents in and lay them down, I'd be looking at generally, the same number of pages as for a PMA for one of these systems. And then infusion pumps also fall into this category, and insulin delivery systems, and negative pressure wound therapy. And here's one example. There are many others of these negative pressure wound therapy products. And a lot of these devices, they're going to be used in a hospital setting or in a healthcare facility, and then go home with the patient. So usually the first experiences a patient is going to have, or a user is going to have with some of these products, maybe in a healthcare facility. But then there are unique considerations when they get home. There are distractions. FDA has done a pretty good job of highlighting some of these kinds of things to be considering in some of their home use guidance. And then on a case-by-case basis, there are some things that you should also be considering here in terms of whether you need to be thinking about both submitting either a 510K or other submission to FDA. But submissions for device types not on the list that was on the previous slide should contain human factors data if an analysis of risk indicates that users performing tasks incorrectly or failing to perform tasks could result in a serious harm. And FDA has called out these types of changes as ones that they're going to look at with enhanced scrutiny on a case-by-case basis. So be aware if you're making any of these kinds of changes, or if any of this is applicable to you, you've got recalls and adverse events, you're making device modifications to bring that product into the home, there are going to be some human factors considerations that you need to take into account. If there's a new use environment, so that could be even going from a home setting to specifically labeling the product for use in, let's say, a moving vehicle, as FDA calls out in this guidance. That might require you to do some more human factors work. So a lot of this is very applicable in the home. And keep in mind, the user interface modifications, FDA is specifically called out, even if you're simplifying the user interface, maybe especially if you're simplifying the user interface, FDA thinks that you need to conduct human factors testing. And then there's some electrical safety and EMC considerations. Here are a couple standards that are referenced in FDA's ASCA pilot guidance. And I joined a couple of them. They actually have 3 bullets, but 2 of those bullets are the exact same standard as far as I'm concerned. I mean, maybe minor differences there, but different recognition number depending on what you're using. And then for EMC information, there's a treasure trove of information around EMC. I'm not going to go into it. It's just it's not specific, I would say, to home use products, but and there are lots of people who can help you in this area. But this resource, in particular, this link that I provided, it's sort of your gateway into all of that information if you need to go down that path and figure out some information, around EMC. And I'll bring up an example here in just a second of some of the potential deficiencies that you might see in this kind of an area if it's applicable to you. And then here's an example of a home use RF EMC deficiency. I think Allison, I shared this with you a while back. I'm not going to read it, but you have the text, and if you're doing anything in the EMC space, just be aware that FDA is going to be looking for you to do testing consistent with this AIM standard 7351731. And I'm not able to find it anywhere else, but this has come up on multiple occasions where FDA wants you to do testing to this specific standard. So just be aware that there are these kinds of considerations. And I think it's important to highlight maybe at the top some of this information that don't try to justify out of doing the testing. Others have gone before you and tried. So FDA is not hearing it. So I would say save yourself the time and the headaches. And if you are trying to get a device into the home and there are EMC considerations, just figure out a way to work this testing in. It's going to save you a lot of headaches. And then here's an example: essential performance deficiency. It's interesting that FDA is calling out essential performance for in a number of areas, and I don't think part of the challenge is essential performance gets defined differently for some of these tests than it does, potentially for how I would think about essential performance for or how I would think about that, that terminology, in other contexts. So just be aware there's maybe some nuance here. You should think about that, and wherever you call out essential performance, maybe give that a little bit more scrutiny. Just be aware if you call out essential performance somewhere, or even if you don't, FDA might be chasing that as something that that you need to pay some more attention to. And then just to highlight again, I mean, Seth's talk was really good, just in general as well. Be aware of cybersecurity, software considerations. If you have a product that has a software or firmware, I mean, FDA has been pushing in these directions as well, where products which I know when I was at FDA, we had some companies who would come in and say, oh, well, we don't have software. We've got hardware direct from some third party. And it's like, well, that hardware has firmware built into it, so how have you considered the risks of this? And I think FDA is chasing that a little bit more, especially in home use environments. I know there are some further considerations as well for what additional risks might exist in a home use environment for products where maybe you don't have the safeguards of healthcare facility personnel on hand readily if something goes wrong. So the set of mitigations that you're considering might be a little bit different, and that might change some of how you go about some of your software issues or cybersecurity as well. And finally, FDA has specifically included considerations about customer service and medical device reporting, or MDRs, in the home use guidance document. I put some other things in here as well, but also those two areas that FDA has highlighted in terms of, what do you do? Where do you go from here once you've actually got a product on the market? That's not the end. You've got registration and listing. You've got customer service aspects you need to be dealing with, adverse event reporting and medical device reports. And at some point, I'm also going to do probably a short little explanation video on some of this as well, where there's a lot of confusion around complaints versus MDRs. And I think some folks at FDA even don't necessarily understand how that set of complaints gets manipulated into the MDRs that FDA requires companies to submit. So I think that's an area where we could get some additional clarity, and then all these other areas as well once you're in the post-market space. And here's just some further resource links. The videos are a little bit dated, so just be aware of that. And it's Rick Fouché. I guess, I don't know. Does anybody know Rick? Is that familiar? I don't know. Who did FDA get to do these videos on their behalf? Anyway, I don't know. So anyway, but there's some webinars and some slides. Actually, the slides are very useful. I don't know how we are for time, but that's what I've got. If I need to eat more time, we can start looking at FDA slides. But just want to end with asking if there are any specific questions. Maybe or
we have some coming from online, and also if anyone has any questions from the audience. I'll start here. One of them is just a comment that this topic has come up in the IVD space for 510Ks, not necessarily for home use, but for point of care.
Yep.
So I think FDA has been looking sort of at their guidance and standard, or using some of their guidance as general use for other areas as well. So thank you for that comment. Next one was, do all electromechanical devices need to go through 60601-1-11, which you brought up? And I think this was the additional comment from them, namely the devices that are intended for home use and professional medical facility use.
Yeah, and just be aware too that those couple standards I put up, that is not the extent of the electrical safety and EMC testing. These are some subparts that are going to be specifically applicable that you need to make sure you consider if you're going from, those are maybe more of a comprehensive list of what you need to consider in addition to what you would have done to put the product into a healthcare facility kind of a setting. So, and just thinking about marketing a product, I guess that's one thing to also highlight, and maybe I sort of touched on it, but this thinking about the path, especially for software, but even for some of these physical devices used in different contexts, starting with a product in a healthcare facility and then taking that same product, making further modifications for home use. That is one of the paths that we see people follow to get products into the home. You may have even done some of your initial development with that pathway in mind. And maybe Jim can speak to this a little bit, as well, in terms of thinking about that pathway. If you have a home use device, would you start in a healthcare facility? Because usually you can get those device clearances for a 510K more readily. Maybe there's slightly different considerations. You've even designed the device a little bit differently, but it sort of creates a platform for you to then sort of jump into more of a home use kind of environment. So it's just something to consider when you're thinking about development. Same kinds of things for software development. Which features are you going to include, and maybe there's some additional features for home use that you would want to have, but you may not need that for the first version that gets in front of healthcare professionals or something.
All right, some of these are getting a little technically detailed, so if you don't have the answer, maybe there's some folks in the audience that might. Next one is it okay not to have essential performance for your device if it's not life supporting?
Personally, I would say yes. I know FDA, I don't know what FDA's position has been on this. I don't know that
We'll
it's
see on
that
it.
it's clear,
Yeah.
but they've pushed for essential performance requirements for products that surprise me.
I don't want to get us too off topic, but I mean, really, industry feels that their devices do not have essential performance, and FDA is feeling that every device has essential performance.
See, I
I
would say both of those positions are wrong, but I don't know.
I definitely agree. But yeah, this question is coming up a lot lately, and there is some disconnect that I cannot figure out.
Yeah.
But so essential performance in the EMC electrical world means that you should be, if you don't have it, or it should be no clinical risk to the patient.
I wouldn't even go that far, right? It's like no serious risk of injury or death in particular. Like if you have a risk for serious injury and death, right? That's
Then
where
have
you
essential
definitely have
perfor-
essential performance,
Yes.
and then maybe it's a gray area for
Yes.
some of the other ones.
Yes, and then I think what we've been coming into, the problem is that if your device has essential, if or FDA is thinking your device has essential performance, and then if it fails, usually there's some other backup, like a clinical backup, so
Yep.
that there is no risk to the patient. But FDA, you really have to explain to FDA how that either clinical backup or other fail-safe really shows that you do not have.
And I've seen for negative
Additional risk.
pressure in particular, this come up where even though the device as designed in a particular failure mode would not have clinical consequences to a patient, because other devices in this area could, because they're designed differently with different types of dressings. FDA required us to consider essential performance that was mitigated by other design features like intrinsic to the device. It's not like this is, oh, this area covers it and we can sort of, put a Band-Aid, so to speak, on it. It's like the device doesn't have this underlying risk, but we still had to consider it as essential performance. So FDA's been pushing in that direction even. So yeah.
Yes, I'm not sure where it's going to lead, but yeah, we're finding that too, that, really industry is not thinking, or they don't really agree that they have essential performance, but they're doing the testing as if they have it, so
Yep.
that, they can
So
get
then
through.
you can leverage it. Yeah.
Yeah. And just the one other thing I was going to say about the EMC and wireless testing, this is in regards to home use, is that it seems like FDA is requiring more labeling to tell the user what, like in the event of an incident, like you lose wireless, you have an EMC event, what are you going to, like, what are you as a patient at home going to do to remedy it, or, or to get the device to work again? So I think we're seeing that a little bit.
Are they expecting human factors testing to substantiate that then?
Well, I guess sometimes, I guess it depends on how complicated the device is, I think. But yeah, we're seeing that in addition to the normal EMC wireless labeling that they always, or hasn't been new and required. Sometimes they're asking for more instructions to the patient or user, I should say.
Do all home use devices require additional ingress protection testing beyond the basic 60601-1 ingress test?
I'm not sure, sorry.
I don't, not that we've seen. It's usually but they do want to make sure that if the person drops it in the toilet or dumps their glass of wine on it, that there's not going to be fluid inside the device. So
yeah,
that is an important standard to follow if you have a home use device.
What we found is that we're going to have to meet IP 22,
okay.
which is basically, you can't put your finger in it and it has to survive drips of a certain rate. And impact dropping and cold stress.
IP22, you said? Okay, that's interesting.
We had to deal with this. We had class 3 active implantable, and yeah, IP rating really depends on the device and how you use it within the home. And I think for IDEs, they do want some sort of testing based on your risk assessment or your hazard analysis. For commercialization, they really want to make sure that you've done all the testing.
This is kind of a follow-up. You were mentioning patient labeling, and when I was at the agency, there was a lot of use of the patient labeling guidance, which was, I think, 2001 or 2002. And then I didn't see it as a consultant. I haven't seen reference to it very much until very recently, and it seems to be coming back. I was wondering if everyone else had similar experience, because that, for those of you who don't know, that labeling guidance for home use, it's patient labeling, and often it's geared toward home use. And there's a lot of clinical validation, extensive human factors that's required as part of that, or suggested as part of that.
I would say for some of the devices I'm familiar with, so for home hemodialysis, for some of the negative pressure that FDA specifically had a focus on for a number of years, it's been more or less a persistent thing, and maybe it's starting to spill over into some other areas, and maybe it's probably area dependent, at least as far as I can tell. And maybe with some of the changes in the agency, we're seeing some broader adoption of some consistency there. I don't know. Maybe Allison's got a better visibility to that. Oh, we got another question.
Yeah, sorry. It's actually a different topic. I'm actually curious to know your thoughts on the enforcement policy for remote monitoring devices that FDA issued during the COVID emergency, and where they basically allow to expand the indication for use to home use. It's like a blanket statement, and to me, it seems that there are thinking, well, the benefits outweigh the risks. And yet, when you go through a regular 510K, they can hammer you on human factor for the device. So yeah, so first, what are your thoughts about that? And then how do you think a company is going to handle, eventually they need to think of, okay, we need to do another 510K if we want to maintain our home use indication. Is FDA is going to allow real world evidence? Are they going to have to do a human factor study?
So my advice would be, you want to be collecting the real world evidence at a minimum. And we talked about this a little bit last year, and I had a conversation with Bill at one of the AdvaMed meetings, where it was just a sort of back and forth on, on this area. And I really don't think FDA's necessarily thought it all the way through, but it was one of these, we've got two bad options. We're in a crisis. We've been resisting this for years. I mean, FDA has resisted some of the remote monitoring, like the moves that would be required to get there, for a long time in some areas that I'm, very, directly familiar with. And this opened the door for some stuff that some companies have been looking to do for a long time, but I would say was necessary in this scenario. You might be in a position where, I mean, the way FDA has been handling some of this, I expect at some point they say, you have to come in with a 510K for any of these kinds of changes, or you have to come in with, depending on what the product is, right? With a supplement, with something. And so you should be collecting real world data. If you've done this, if you've gotten yourself into this sort of unenviable position where now, FDA could change their mind, they're going to give you probably a runway. There's going to be time. I mean, this is what we've heard from leadership, but you can't pull some of those changes out of a product and just go back to the previous iteration of the software usually, because I mean, there might be a rare unicorn of a product where you could do that. You could just revert it, flash it back to the previous version of the software. But in most cases, you're making a bunch of other changes iteratively over time, and it would be a nightmare to try to pull out that one feature 20 steps down the line in terms of what you've done. So you should be planning to submit it to FDA and at some point, and be collecting whatever evidence you think is necessary, to do that. And I would say real world evidence is a good start. FDA seems to be open to that, but I would also suggest if you do a good job of it, probably FDA will accept it. I can't say it's a sure thing by any means, but if they start seeing a number of companies do it badly, probably the iron curtain comes down for everybody to some extent. So I'm hoping, yeah, we'll see. It's a big area of uncertainty, and I'd say do everything you can to protect yourself and be an early come in with an early submission. If you've got data you think is sufficient, you already have it. FDA hasn't said you have to remove it yet. Go in with a 510K. Go in with a PMA supplement now. Do it soon. Do it as soon as you've got data that you think is going to substantiate or support that change, and lock it in while we're still in this sort of limbo situation before you get to the back end, and then you have a hammer. You don't want to be there.
Great questions. And someone confirmed online as well that we have been doing IP22 tests for all of our devices. So
Wow.
it sounds something we should all be paying attention to.